so much for that really lovely introduction, Carol. Welcome everyone to Catalyzing Climate Justice. Just as Carol said, I'm joined today by Nellis Kennedy-Howard and Reverend Lennox Yearwood. And our panelists have extensive and interesting bios. The links to those should be available to the audience right now. And just as a reminder to our listeners that you may enter your questions into the chat throughout and as we go along, and we hope to leave time at the end of the session to answer them. So welcome Nellis and Reverend Yearwood. I feel so honored to be here with the two of you today, and let's get into it. So to begin with, I know that everyone would really love to hear how the two of you came to do your climate justice work and what got you started. So Nellis, let's start with you.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me on, Rafi, and for all of the things that you do for climate. Yeah, how did I come about doing climate justice work? So I was actually in law school at the time, and in my 20s, and I remember sitting in a class, natural resources and Indian country class, and I remember seeing my tribe's name in the textbook. And I looked at it, and typically when you see your tribe's name mentioned in a legal textbook, it's not necessarily a good thing because of the history of the federal government with tribes. And so when I looked at it, I started reading, and I didn't understand what I was reading. It was actually something about what is known as the Church Rock uranium spill. I don't know if you all have ever heard of the Church Rock uranium spill, but it's actually the country's largest radioactive spill, much bigger than 3 Mile Island. And as a result, hundreds, if not thousands of uranium mines are abandoned on my tribe's reservation. And I started to connect the dots of why my mother had fought thyroid cancer twice. Thyroid cancer is closely connected and tied to radiation. And it kind of changed the entire course of my life. I looked at it and I was mad. I was really mad. I was upset. And it kind of threw me down this place of I was already really dedicated to social justice. But I learned that what I was also working on and why I was so motivated is because of something called environmental justice and climate justice. And because of that, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a difference for my people and for all of the bad projects that happen on the Navajo reservation. But also to be a part of the solution, right? To create positive change for my people. And so I continue that work today as a Navajo woman. I'm also a firm believer that we are supposed to care for the world 7 generations out from us. And it's easier for me to understand that now that I'm a mother. I have a little toddler, and I'm also pregnant right now. I'm in my 3rd trimester. And so for me, thinking about 7 generations after me and what am I doing for my kids and their kids and their kids so that they don't have to worry about the same things that my family has worried about.
Thank you so much, Nellis. I definitely understand that motivation of anger and also wanting to make this space a better place for future generations. Over to you, Reverend Yearwood.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be on this panel with both of you. And good luck next year at Princeton. I'm sure you'll do amazing there. Go Tigers. And so one of the things for me in doing this work really goes back to Hurricane Katrina. And literally, I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, I witnessed my family and friends, because I'm originally from Louisiana. I witnessed seeing my family and friends left behind in the richest country in the world. And to see your family and your friends drowning is one of the most horrific things you could ever imagine. But to hear the stories of Mama D, who lived on Derjewan Street in the 7th Ward of New Orleans, to hear her stories that she would tell that she would catch her elderly neighbors who are floating down the street and tie them to a tree. Those things motivated me to use my platform at the time, working with the Hip Hop Caucus to create change. We had just got finished doing an amazing voting campaign from Vote or Die and other campaigns. And so we want to use that to create change. But one of the things that went further than that in that process wasn't just Hurricane Katrina, but it was looking at the injustice. So looking at that, if Hurricane Katrina had not happened, looking at why they called my home state of Louisiana a cancer alley, and looking at all the petrochemical facilities and the toxins that are spewed across Texas and Louisiana and in native land and in indigenous communities and throughout West Virginia. And seeing that and seeing communities called the sacrifice zone or the path of least resistance, seeing that they would be deemed communities where you can just put these things in those communities. So that is what motivated me. So for me, in many cases, the inconvenient truth, and I love that documentary from Al Gore, but the inconvenient truth just wasn't the environmental crisis, but it was also white supremacy. It was the fact that racial justice is climate justice, and climate justice is racial justice, and continuing to see people post-Katrina, Maria, Harvey, and on and on and on, wildfires, droughts, wars now, Ukraine and Russia being fought over the climate crisis. I realized this is not a game. And so I would have to do everything that I could do, particularly with our organization, to use storytelling and narrative organizing and policy and advocacy, whatever we could do to ensure that horrors of seeing senior citizens or children drowning in this country or anywhere never happens again.
That was so powerful. Thank you, Reverend Yearwood. And Nellis, you just explained how your family and community have been directly impacted by environmental racism, and you just touched on that as well, Reverend Yearwood. Nellis, would you be able to give us a quick explanation of environmental racism and also share a little bit about what people who are not currently on the front lines of the climate crisis can do to advocate for those who are?
Definitely, definitely. And I love the way that you said it, Reverend Yearwood, of, climate justice can't exist without racial justice, right? And how white supremacy is at the root of so many of the causes of it all. Environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on communities of color. It's like all other forms of racism, right? Systems have been designed to benefit certain communities more than others. And the result is that marginalized communities of color, become even more marginalized. And communities that have the most to lose. And they're oftentimes the least equipped or the least supported or even the least likely to be heard to develop solutions for climate justice themselves. So, as far as if you're not on the front lines, what do you do and how do you contribute? I think that looking around you, find out what are the injustices that are happening near you in your city or in your state. And then think about where do your talents and your skills lie, as well as what type of power or influence do you have as an individual? And then kind of create a Venn diagram of those things, right? Like what's happening in your state, what are your skills, what's your power and your privilege, and figure out where you can best apply your efforts and your resources. And that might mean a lot of different things. It might mean that you go out and you volunteer, right? It might mean that you open up your wallet and that you start giving to causes that that can make a difference. It might mean that you are out there knocking on doors or petitioning or voting or getting out the vote. It might mean that you are writing if you're a writer or raising awareness in some way. But first and foremost, before you take action, I highly recommend that when you find out what are the injustices near you, but you find out the goals, the needs, and the direction that the community that is impacted wants to take. Right? So think about prioritizing them first rather than putting forward what you see as a solution for them. gather input, do your research and get some understanding. And then from there, think about what is the role that's appropriate for you. That way, you're not distracting from existing work that frontline communities are already fighting for, but you're contributing to it and you're helping along the way.
Thank you so much. I think that that was such a great answer. And definitely in the JYC climate movement, we talk a lot about this idea of collective liberation and that we need to be working to fight all types of injustice, not just working for climate justice, but working for racial justice, because all of these things are things that go together. You can't have one without the other. So now over to you for a little bit, Reverend Yearwood. You've both noted that there are intersectionalities between systemic racism and the climate crisis. And I know that the Hip Hop Caucus is currently mobilizing communities of color to shut down petrochemical plants. And I can see it on your hat. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, about the work that you've been doing to shut down those chemical plants and how you've been seeing the climate crisis and systemic racism interact with one another.
Most definitely. Well, let me just say this. As far as we know, nature itself is not racist. And so let me clarify that. Folks will say, well, the air racist and the water racist. As far as I know, no, I haven't come across any water or air that's racist. What is racist, though, is unfortunately those companies that is built upon greed, and their business plan means a death sentence for certain communities. What is racist is when you're in those boardrooms and you know that 68% of people of color live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. What is racist is when you look at maps and communities and you literally put toxins and facilities next to communities that are predominantly Black and brown and indigenous. That is what is racist. And when that then pollutes those communities, that then you're putting pipelines in Standing Rock that can break and pollute those communities' water supplies, or the Mahalia pipeline in Memphis, Tennessee, that can pollute particularly Black people who are living in Memphis, Tennessee, or the Mountain Valley pipeline, or Line 3, or Line 6, or the Coast pipeline, where you're putting these things in direct relationship to people of color, and particularly poor people of color and poor people, then that is what environmental racism is. It is not just the environment, but it is those of us humans who are literally putting toxins and petrochemicals and fossil fuels in direct harm of these communities, killing them, causing them to have asthma and emphysema and cancer. And so what we're talking about here in that regard is that cycle. And so with petrochemicals in the communities that I'm come from in Louisiana, you're dealing with the same situation, like the Formosa plant in St. James Parish, Louisiana, in which it's a foreign company that is literally doing single-use plastics and fertilizer and putting it, again, in communities of color. On top of that, what is so egregious in many cases is that they're putting these facilities and plants in places that used to be former plantations. It is outrageous in some cases what they would do in regards to not looking at the human aspect, the humanity of their neighbors in many cases. And so environmental racism stems from that. But let me say this too, that I don't want to make sure and just point the finger at only the fossil fuel industry. The environmental movement has a racist past as well. And so before we get high on our horse and begin to think about what we have done and looking at those who are creating fossil fuel industries, we look at many organizations who have stymied the voices of Black, brown, and indigenous leaders, many people who have stymied the powerful voices of environmental justice communities, many voices who have overlooked and taken the side of the fossil fuel industry. Even within that, many people who have been particularly white communities who have then looked at their own privilege and their own access and not looked at what it means to share that. So let's be very clear. This goes both ways. And so injustice isn't just one-sided. And so for us to change it, to really find liberation, it isn't just about a kumbaya moment, a moment where we can just come together and be all feel good. It's a moment when we all can be serious about the problem, because when you have pollution, pollution regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat. if you're rich or poor, if you have dirty water, it doesn't matter where you're from. But when you're putting that dirty water and that pollution directly in communities who suffer first and worst, if the climate crisis is impacting those who are suffering first and worst, that is the injustice that we have to change. And so that's what we have to do. In Hip Hop Caucus, we're trying our best to raise our voices and to use storytelling and narrative organizing, because we feel that, using telling things through documentaries and through cinema and through music, and through culture, using one's cultural expression to shape one's political experience. Mm-hmm. We believe that's the best way to reach all communities and to level the playing field, to not be revolutionary, but to also be solutionary, to find solutions to these problems. So that's what we do at Hip Hop Caucus. And I encourage everybody who's watching this right now to go to hiphopcaucus.org to see all the things we're doing and help us and participate and be a part of our movement to use culture to create change.
Yes, thank you. I so strongly believe in the power of storytelling and culture to shape narratives about climate justice and to help us achieve our goals. So I think that's really great. And you actually just answered what was going to be my next question, which was how can we ensure that the climate work that we're doing does include and uplift oppressed groups in this country and doesn't leave them out or leave them behind or kind of exclude them. And I think that you gave a really thoughtful answer that I can definitely take to heart. And then before we move on to audience questions, which I think we're going to do in just a minute or two, I wanted to ask one more question about an intersection of identities, that of religion and climate activism. So as a founding member of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, I know that I've become really keenly aware of how my faith guides my climate work, in that there are so many environmental texts in the Torah that I'm inspired by, and Jewish values like repairing the world, passing our tradition from generation to generation, which now, as I understand, you have something similar. And since you guys are both religious leaders, I'm really curious as to how your religious backgrounds show up in your climate work. So can you each speak a little bit to that, starting with you, Reverend Yearwood?
Yes, indeed. Faith is everything. I use my faith to keep me going. I would encourage everybody, no matter what your faith tradition may be, if it's Buddhist, if it's Christian, if it's Muslim, if it's Jewish, whatever it may be, if it's theist or atheist, to be honest, that I encourage you to do this work. You can't do this work by pulling on yourself, because you become, if you're doing this work and all you're doing is pulling on your own energy, you become jaded or bitter or cynical. And so to do this work, you really need to pull on what I would feel is something invisible, something else besides you. And for me, it's my faith, but it could be something else to do this work, because it's very difficult, actually, because we're actually at a very critical moment in time. We're in a time we're not talking about just about equality, but about existence. We're talking about a situation where we're talking about people who put greed before people, putting profits before people, people who will literally poison children, causing mothers to have stillborn births because of their greed. Those are hard things to grasp, to kind of get your head around. And if you don't have something to kind of pull on, something this beautiful, something powerful besides yourself, it will consume you. And then you can't do this work. You become angry. You become frustrated. You'll be kicking concrete, as they say. You'll be mad for being mad safe. So faith for me is critical in that regard, to help to learn. And then for me, my faith helps me also to realize that the battle is not yours. And so a lot of times for young people, particularly, a lot of young people think that they have to do it all. They have to create their own program, their own organization. They have to have their own network. And that's important, to be aggressive and to be persistent, but to also know that with faith, that this is not just about you, that this is a relay race. There's folks who you don't even know exist who are also doing this battle. And knowing in the heart of your hearts that organized people beats organized money every single time. And with faith, we can make sure that things happen. And so that's how powerful faith, and we only can use faith in this moment here when we are on the teetering part of catastrophe. We need faith to keep us to hold on, to push on, and to move on.
Yes, absolutely. Movements fight systems, and this is how we're going to tackle the issue. That's the only way. I completely agree. Over to you, Nellis.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree with everything that Reverend Yearwood said. And I grew up hunting and fishing outside. I grew up in Colorado and loving the outdoors and enjoying it and understanding how nature works and how we're a part of nature. But ultimately, I think it was the intersection of my identities, as you said, that leads me to do the work that I do today. As a Christian, I am deeply moved by the idea and call of conservation and stewardship of the earth, both nature and wildlife. I mean, everything from the Garden of Eden to the shepherd's care of their sheep. It's to me, it's just so clear that that is what I believe that I am called to do, as a Christian, is to care for the world that God created. And as a Native woman, speaking of intersecting identities, as a Native woman and as a Christian, I'm also a firm believer that water is sacred. Right? Water contains healing, it's purifying, it brings people together, it's life. Water is life in so many ways. And so, just being a mother, just thinking about being pregnant and the significance of water, right? Of my baby right now being in water. How can we preserve the world around us for the generations to come? And I just love what you said, Reverend Yearwood, about not just being revolutionary, but solutionary, of thinking about not just fighting against things, but what are we putting out into the world that is positive? And how can we keep doing that as we go forward?
Thank you so much. I can see that our clock is ticking and we're starting to get some questions from the audience. So the first question that I have here is, how do we deal with the politicization of climate change? And another one that's here is how to switch from fear to love. So maybe if we could just use these last 3 minutes to answer both of those questions, starting with you, Nellis.
Yeah. How do we move from fear to love? I love that question. So I'm going to start with that question. I think that that is a beautiful thing to think about. Right now, one of my daughter's favorite stories, she's 2 and she's like absolutely just like gorgeous. I love my little girl. She's 2 years old. And like one of her favorite books right now is Climate Change for Babies. And she can go through. And I'll tell you what, climate change for babies isn't scary. Right? It's not fear driven. It's not fear mongering. It's the reality of there we have a problem. The earth is getting sick, and she can tell you all about the earth's blanket and how it controls the temperature of the earth's plate, the temperature of the earth. But of course the book ends on demanding climate action now, thinking about what can we do as individuals. It's very individual focused because of the level that it is about, things like solar and things like wind and things like transportation and all of those things. But in addition to that, there is also that revolutionary piece of it of like individuals can contribute so much, but they have to hold corporations accountable. They have to hold the boards of directors that Reverend Yearwood was talking about accountable to creating more solutions. And you can do that by building that movement of love, being aligned around a shared vision of having a positive, safe, healthy environment for not only for your family, but for families to come.
Yeah. Reverend Yearwood, do you want to add something before we run out of time? I would say more, but I don't want to take up the time.
No, I just simply say that I agree with everything that's been said. And I think that we have to shape policy, because either you shape policy or policy shapes you. And so I think we have to realize that there are folks on both sides and take that very seriously. And so that's the one thing there. And we must be engaged in democracy at every level to ensure that we can have Mini Wachoni, know that water is life. And so that's one thing. On the other stand, with love, I think love is everything we have in this process, that we realize that 100 years from now, in 21, 22, that none of us who are watching this will be here. But what will be here will be love. And our love for humanity will make sure they have clean air and clean water. Our love for humanity will make sure that they have a sustainable and livable climate. Love will make sure that the next generation, even when we're no longer here, it's the reason why we have from gay rights to women's rights to overcoming slavery. It was love that overcame all those things. And it will be love that will overcome the climate crisis. So I thank you for having me. I hope everybody will go to hiphopcaucus.org and see our work. Check out our podcast, The Coolest Show. And thank you for having me.
What a wonderful place to end on. What a wonderful idea to leave in everyone's heads as we end this session. Reverend Yearwood and Nellis, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. You've given all of us so much to think about. And I'm so thankful that people like you are dedicating your lives to make sure that people like me and people after me and after me and after me and after me are going to have better futures for youth, younger children everywhere. So Carol, now back over to you. Thank you so much for having me here today.